Nothing gets seared into your brain quite like the first game you ever fell in love with. It might be the first game you ever played. It could be the first game you ever beat front to back by yourself. Or I guess it could just be an audio-visual thing. Something you thought looked cool or sounded cool and it blew you away. And then you fell in love with it from there. For me, my first love was Rygar. But not the arcade game that made a name for itself first. I'm talking about the NES conversion, which, of course, was not a conversion at all. That was a completely different game. That NES version of Rygar didn't have that strict linearity of the arcade game, but it had these large, expansive areas you could roam around in. You could fight these weird creatures with names that I could not pronounce as a kid, and some of them I still can't pronounce. You could hear some incredible music that still to this day is my absolute favorite NES soundtrack. And most importantly, for the purposes of this podcast, you leveled up and you found several items that let you access more and more of this large, interconnected world. Because that's right, Rygar is the first example of a Rygar-troid. What? Wait, we don't call them Rygar-troids here? Did I just step into the wrong timeline? Oh no, wait, it's just Fine Time.
Fine Time.
I'm sick. I'm sick. I'm sick. Head deadly. I'm sick.
Hello, party people. It's your boy Dre. It feels very bizarre to say hello, party people, to absolutely nobody. Because that's right, I am by myself today. I am doing the thing that I thought I would never do when I started Fine Time. I'm doing a solo show. I almost can't believe it myself, to be honest. And this is something I've actually wanted to talk about for months now. And I kept putting it off because, I don't know, I kept trying to build it out, and I'm like, oh, this could be a good segment, and I'm like, this feels bigger than a segment, this feels like it's its own show, and then I was trying to find a partner for it, but that never really materialized, and then I still really wanted to do this topic, so I was like, fuck it, I'll do it myself. So, I'm here, and forgive me if this is a bumpy road, but I've obviously never attempted anything like this before, and I'm going to try my best to make this as interesting as I possibly can. So, if you're a listener of Fine Time, you already know that I hate the term Metroidvania. I hate it. Steve is less spiteful towards it than I am, and I would say Kevin is completely indifferent towards it. But me, I can't stand it. I think it is the worst for many, many reasons, hopefully of which I'll detail here today. On Fine Time, we always make a joke out of it, where I bleep out the word if anyone says it, usually Kevin, which is funny, and we make a bit out of it, but I've never actually articulated exactly why I hate it. I always just figured it was because it was such a stupid term that it was so obvious why I hate it, but of course that's not the case because people have varying opinions on these kinds of things, right? So, if you don't mind, let's just really sit down together and talk about this once and for all, shall we? So I guess we should start by laying down exactly how I feel right from the outset here, just so there's no confusion. Metroidvania is an extremely silly term that does a disservice to everybody involved and the games involved. It's misappropriated. It's misused. It's also a misnomer, but even then, not really. And despite having somewhat legit origins, Metroidvania as a term is now completely worthless as a descriptor. And you can look no further from the litany of indie developers who invoke it all the time in their game descriptions. You guys seen that, right? I straight up It's gotten to the point where I straight up avoid any indie game with Metroidvania in the description, and I know I'm not the only one. We're sick of that shit. And I'm sorry to state the obvious here, but for the sake of being thorough, I'm going to do so. We don't need to be out here glomming two words together for no goddamn reason. Like, in the 90s, we did not call them Wolfendooms. Bro, they were just Doom clones. Because Doom was the progenitor, and yes, I know the term Doom clone was used often as a pejorative back then, but, the point stands. We didn't call Bloody Roar or Fighting Vipers a Virtua Tekken. Man, they were just 3D fighters. Like, there is an actual reason why the term Metroidvania came into use, and it has nothing to do with how we use it now, but more on that later. As it stands, I hate it. I hate Metroidvania. We're slapping two things together, or rather, the idea of two things together that don't need to be together. It's detrimental. The whole point of a catch-all term like Metroidvania is to be communicable of an idea, of a concept, of a style, a game feel, whatever, right? Metroidvania as a term is very bad at communicating those things. Especially the way it's used nowadays. So yeah, if you want a baseline understanding of how I feel about the word Metroidvania, that's it, in a nutshell. It's bad as a descriptor, and it's bad as a word. Oh, by the way, we're doing this again right now with another term. We're not learning from our mistakes. And you know what it is, right? Anyone out there ever come across the term Soulsborne? Yeah, that's a thing right now, because we apparently do not learn our lessons from history, and we are doomed to repeat them. Soulsborne, we're out here saying, in these streets. I do often see the term Souls-like as well, which is obviously a much more communicable term. But no, we somehow feel the need, once again, to glom Bloodborne into Dark Souls for no fucking reason and say Soulsborne when we could just be saying Souls-like, but I guess we're just gonna do what we do, huh? Jesus Christ. But anyway, besides Metroidvania being a bad descriptor of a genre, it's also just straight up disrespectful to Metroid. And trust me, I know exactly how that sounds, okay? Believe me. You're talking about respecting the sanctity of a video game, bro? How about you log off, you fucking dork? Plus L, plus ratio, etc. Like, I get it. Truthfully, guilty as charged, okay? But hear me out on this one, and I think you'll understand. We never grafted another game onto Rogue. Rogue gets to stand alone. Forever. Rogue gets to be known as the progenitor of a genre for all time because of the term roguelike. Like, do most people even know that Rogue is, like, a real game and not just a word we call stuff with, like, some randomized elements or whatever? I don't think they do, and they don't have to. Because Rogue is written into history. Because of roguelike. So, then the argument becomes, if Rogue isn't even well known enough as a game anymore to matter like that, what does it matter what you call a Metroid-like or whatever, right? And I say to that, it matters because the game that gets enshrined as a term is a game that gets to live forever as a reference point for everybody, regardless of your age or knowledge or whatever. Almost everyone who plays video games knows what a roguelike is. And if you don't, you could spend like 5 seconds on Google and find out there was a game called Rogue. Boom. Done. You can spend 5 seconds on Google and find out there was a game called Cabal, and therefore there was a mini-genre called Cabal shooters, right? Boom. Done. Metroid should also be immortalized in the same fashion. But unfortunately, it's not, because we decided they should be called Metroid fucking Vanias instead. We're out here enshrining Cabal for some reason, a game only old arcade heads like me know about at this point, and we can't give Metroid the same treatment? That fucking sucks, man. Like, straight up, Metroid deserves to be immortalized on its own accord. And again, some people will probably argue that you don't need to explain the etymology of the term Metroidvania so much as just like give examples of the genre, right? But that presumes the person that you're talking to actually knows the examples you bring up. Because what if they don't? You know what you can point to as an example of a roguelike? Fucking Rogue. You know? What do you point to as an example of a Metroidvania? Metroid Dread? Well, no, that's just a Metroid game, right? So why are we saying Vania? Vice versa, if you say a Castlevania game, then why are you saying Metroid? That's what makes it such a bad descriptor. You should never have to explain a good descriptor. When you're talking music and you say grunge, people know exactly what you mean. You can't say someone will know exactly what you mean when you say Metroidvania. Because I don't think that's the case. And that's just one reason among many other reasons why Metroidvania is a bad term.
Fine time.
This part of the story often gets forgotten because of how long it's been since the term Metroidvania was coined, but here's something I want to remind everybody of, because it's easy to forget this, especially if you're not old, like me. Metroidvania was originally a term used to refer to Castlevania games only. It was an acknowledgement of the change in style of Castlevania games, let's say post-1997, let's say from Symphony of the Night onwards, versus the relatively linear structures of previous Castlevania games. That's why we started saying it in the first place. And it was certainly never used to describe a Metroid game. That is so offensive. And hey, you know what? Even that original premise of Metroidvania is problematic because, guess what? Simon's Quest is already a Metroidvania. That came out in 1988, baby. Does anyone care about that? No, we don't, because that game isn't that good. But that's why all of this is bullshit. But I digress. So here's something else that always bothers me when it comes to the Castlevania side of this. What if someone's reference point for Castlevania isn't the narrow definition we make it out to be now, with the term Metroidvania? What if someone has only played the original Castlevania? What if they have only played Super Castlevania 4 or Castlevania Bloodlines? Right? If they see the term Metroidvania on any of the thousands of mediocre indie games that invoke it in their product description, and they pick up that game, and it's nothing like what they remember Castlevania being. So then what good is that term doing anybody? And on the flip side of that, if someone picks up, say, Castlevania Collection for $5 right now on PSN or Nintendo eShop, hardly any of those games are going to be of the Metroidvania sort. And the one that is pretty unapproachable in Simon's Quest. So what are we even doing here? That's why the Vania part of Metroidvania makes no damn sense, guys. But to be fair, someone might make the argument that the Castlevania games we would describe as Metroidvania are more recent than those old games, and therefore, more in memory for people. And, folks, Symphony of the Night is 26 years old. The last real Castlevania of that type was Order of Ecclesia, and that was 2008, baby. That was 15 years ago. God damn it. And those are just as bygone as anything from the 80s and 90s. Okay, not really, but you know what I'm trying to say. If something's old, then it's old. Castlevania hasn't been a thing for a very long time now. So to me, it's all in the past. And like I said, that Castlevania collection is out there for $5 on all platforms, so someone could just be playing that right now, being ooh, I want to experience some Metroidvania, and they won't get it from that. And look, let me be completely honest here, okay? If the term Metroidvania had just stuck to that original meaning of just referring to Castlevania games of a certain gameplay structure, shall we say, I could have lived with that. I could have. I still wouldn't have liked it very much, just as like a word. I think it's stupid. But at least that way, Metroidvania would mean a specific thing to a specific series, and the context would make sense, right? But no, we had to bring Metroidvania to the world at large, and I really wish we hadn't. By the way, I don't know if anyone remembers this, before Metroidvania caught on as a term, a not insignificant amount of people used to say Castletroid. No, I am not making that up. I swear to God, people said Castletroid. Shout out to anyone old enough to remember the Castletroid era.
Fine time.
Okay, so some would argue, I feel like I'm saying that a lot this episode, some would argue that the term Metroidvania has superseded its original origins and has become a word unto itself, describing like a specific genre and game feel, not really having anything to do with its namesake. And okay, how about this? I got some truther shit for you guys, okay? Let me put on my truther hat. I think Metroidvania is a lie. I think it may not exist at all. Because I feel sometimes we are really describing some very specific thing that doesn't actually exist. What do you think of that shit? Huh? But before we get to that ambiguity, let me talk a little more about why I feel both Metroid and Castlevania are being done a disservice by the term Metroidvania. Let me explain what I mean. What does the Mummy Demastered have to do with either Metroid or Castlevania? Nothing, in my opinion. What does Hollow Knight have to do with either Metroid or Castlevania? Does anyone really feel like Hollow Knight is like either of those games? Because I don't at all. You see what I mean? Like, I feel like we're just saying Metroidvania for no reason in those instances. And then you have instances where it feels like it resembles one game, but not the other. Right? Because Axiom Verge, it may be like Metroid, but it's certainly nothing like Castlevania. Bloodstained, obviously, is like Castlevania, but it's nothing like Metroid. Right? So does anyone out there feel like this is a really stupid term to describe a genre? I don't feel like we should be saying this. Anyway, back to the point of, can Metroidvania be used disassociatively? That's not a word, is it? Disassociatively. It is now. Can it be used disassociatively? I still say no, it can't. It's already been ruined by everybody. Metroidvania means nothing. It means so much nothing now to the point where people even use it generically to describe games with backtracking. You ever notice that? Do you know how insane it makes me when people describe fucking Luigi's Mansion as a Metroidvania just because you go back to an area you've already been to? That's not what any of this means! Like, God, I told myself I wouldn't yell today because I'm yelling at nobody. I'm talking to myself. Oh my God. But for real though, that drives me crazy. Like, old survival horror games, okay, for another example. Like, not even survival horror, but like fixed perspective games that like Resident Evil or Onimusha or whatever, right? Those have a lot more in common with what someone might consider a Metroidvania, and we don't call them that. Wouldn't it feel extremely silly to describe Resident Evil or Dino Crisis or Onimusha as a Metroidvania? That would be stupid, right? So why are we calling the Mummy Demastered one? Why are we calling Hollow Knight one? Why are we calling Jedi Survivor one? Isn't that stupid as hell? So maybe we should just stop. I need a drink.
Fine time.
Okay. I've calmed down. I'm sorry. I got a little up there a second ago. Okay, I'm cool. I'm gonna play it cool, baby. All right. I have a theory. Okay, and it might sound like I'm gatekeeping. Yeah, I'm warning you now. It might sound slightly gatekeepy, but follow me on this one. Okay, just hear me out. Sometimes I feel like we are not actually talking about Metroid or Castlevania at all. Or at least not as a whole. I feel like we are specifically talking about two games. Super Metroid and Symphony of the Night. Two games everyone decided everyone must play for some reason. The two games that solely define this genre for some people. If you want to call it a genre. Because if you notice, people don't actually say stuff as like Metroid. They say it's like Super Metroid specifically. Y'all ever notice that? I spoke about this a second ago, but you know how people call Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor Metroidvanias, right? Something that obviously drives me insane. But it's not just because of the word Metroidvania. It drives me insane because there's a very specific comp nobody makes. Those Jedi games are like Metroid Prime. Those Jedi games are Metroid Prime as fuck. Not Super Metroid or any other Metroid. Prime. And before anyone says it, yes, I know there's a Super Metroid reference in Jedi Survivor, so shut the fuck up. Don't at me, bro. Right? I get it. I've seen it. Okay? Anyway, those are the kinds of nuances we lose when we try to use a catch-all term like Metroidvania. We lose all the individuality of the games that are actually in those series that we could make much more direct reference points to, you know? But why use your brain? We could just say Metroidvania, I guess, right? So, whatever. But even more than Super Metroid, people love saying stuff is like Symphony of the Night. Not Castlevania or any specific Castlevania games, just Symphony of the Night, or SOTN in that stupid abbreviated form that I am so sick of seeing. Like, Castlevania doesn't matter to those people at all. SOTN does, or at least the idea of it. But there's a reason why people seem to like that particular game, besides just groupthink. Symphony of the Night is actually not very much like Castlevania at all. And that's why when Symphony came out, I was real disappointed when I first played it. I really was. And that was for several reasons, but it took me years and years to figure out that the chief reason was because of its aesthetic. And that's something I actually realized during our Castlevania Advanced Collection podcast, and thank you if you've been with us long enough to have heard that, because that was 1.5 years ago, so you were on the shit real early, so thank you. Something I realized during that discussion with Trey is that one of the reasons why I initially didn't like Symphony of the Night was because it was so radically different in art style and music and feel and stuff than previous games. It wasn't the open-ended exploring. Simon's Quest was also radically different in design than the original Castlevania, but it looked and felt and sounded like Castlevania. Symphony doesn't feel like Castlevania. It's really missing that old-timey Universal monsters or like Halloween-y feel. Mummies and bats and weird creatures that pop out of coffins and shit. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, Symphony has some of those enemies, but it didn't feel like it did before. It was too beautified. It was too pretty. You know what I mean? It was too gentrified. Stop the gentrification of Castlevania. I got a perfect comp for this. I have a perfect comp. Okay, check this out. So, assuming you're like a regular dude of regular means like me, you know how you go to a more upscale restaurant than you're used to, and you order something like, chicken parmesan, and they make it like too fancy? Like the marinara is like swooshed around the plate just so, instead of like, being on top of the chicken. And then there's like not enough cheese, they're like skimping on the mozzarella and parmesan. You know what I mean? Almost like they were afraid of like sogging out the chicken cutlet with the sauce because that's not the fancy thing to do. When in fact, that's exactly the thing they're supposed to be doing. That's what Symphony of the Night was to me. It was like a rich man's idea of Castlevania, or in this case, a rich man's idea of chicken parmesan. Like, it wasn't bad, but it just wasn't right, you know? And anyway, my point is, because Symphony of the Night is so different from the games before it, and quite frankly, the games after it, it puts it in a weird spot where people make comparisons to only that game. And therefore, it's an expectation of Castlevania that's an outlier. And I think my theory on this is completely proven by the initial reaction to Circle of the Moon, the first Game Boy Advance game, which was after Symphony of the Night, it kept that gameplay style, that Metroidvania style, if you want to say that. But it was a return to the previous Castlevania aesthetic of like spoopy Halloween shit, right? And it had that biting difficulty, right? Also return to that. It's another reason why I didn't like Symphony. It was too easy. But somehow, Circle of the Moon is considered lesser than Symphony of the Night. And also, at the time, somehow considered lesser than Harmony of Dissonance, which is an objectively atrocious game. But it just so happened to get closer to that Symphony of the Night aesthetic, right? So somehow it got good marks from reviewers, fucking tasteless reviewers, who just check to see if something looks and sounds the part. They don't bother to dig any deeper than that. Oh, well, it looks okay. It plays, let's give it an 8. No, Harmony of Dissonance is awful. And it proves that nobody cared enough about Castlevania as a whole to even call that out, because they obviously didn't play them before. Because they played Symphony of the Night. They played SOTN, not Castlevania. They played Rich Man's Castlevania. Again, I'm sorry. I told you this wasn't going to sound gatekeepy, and I'm sure that it sounds that way, so feel free to call me out on that, but honestly, I feel like this is true. My point of saying all of this is, Castlevania heads or Metroid heads don't really think about the genre in that kind of narrow terms, because they played all the games and they know better. It's like the joke when the guy in college sees Citizen Kane or Psycho for the first time, and then everything becomes a comparison to that. Except it's Super Metroid, or SOTN, right? We aren't describing a genre. We're describing people's nostalgia of what they think something is. And quite frankly, it sucks. We need to discuss art better than that.
Pine time.
Okay, so I've been doing a lot of bitching, okay? Obviously. But what do I actually want? I can bitch about Metroidvania all I want, but it's not going away. Right? So what do I actually want to happen here? I want us to have better reference points, something I think I've well established already, but I also want our language to evolve. So I'll give you some examples. When I was a kid, shooter didn't mean first-person shooter, mainly because they didn't exist yet. It used to mean what we now call a shmup, or shoot-'em-up. You know, an auto-scrolling, often vertically oriented thing where you control a plane and you grab power-ups and you shoot down many other planes or aliens or whatever, right? Sometime around the rise of, let's say, Call of Duty, shooter started being short for first-person shooter, which totally made sense because shmups have been on the outs for years at that point. That wasn't really a genre we did anymore. So it made sense for something else to start being called a shooter. We evolved our language on that one for the better, you know? And speaking of first-person shooters, remember earlier when I mentioned Doom clones? We don't say that anymore. We call them boomer shooters, a term I love. That is perfect. That is how you coin a new phrase. I love the term boomer shooter. I also like loot shooter or looter shooter in the same vein, something like Borderlands or The Division or whatever, Destiny, right? Loot shooter or looter shooter. Excellent, right? So with that established, let me say this. Remember when an adventure game was something where you searched areas and you used items on stuff to either further a story or get other places? hey, doesn't that sound like Metroid? That's why we used to call those games action-adventure games. Because they combined that adventure gameplay and added, platforming and shooting and stuff, a literal merging of action and adventure. And before we say that's an outdated concept, because it sort of is, let's be real, we still widely use that term today. Hey everybody, what award did Metroid Dread win at the Game Awards last year? That's right, it won Best Action Adventure Game. When Metroid trends on Twitter even, it trends under action adventure games. So why can't we just say action adventure still instead of Metroidvania? Like, why not? It's right there. Sure, the bulk of, AAA games out there go for that, generic, genre-less type of thing that maybe you could also describe as action-adventure, but I still think we know what we mean when we say that. I still think action-adventure can be used now, unlike shooter, which has been completely taken over by the idea of the FPS, And some people have tried to update the term Metroidvania to search action, which I am not a fan of that either, but I could get behind that if I needed to. If it meant that we stopped saying Metroidvania, I could get behind search action. Steve seems to be a proponent of search action, but I just feel at that rate we may as just still say action adventure. I don't know. At any rate, all I'm saying is that we need to evolve our language. Terms change with the times, and Metroidvania needs to change too. It's been many, many years since we coined Metroidvania, and we still say it. We haven't reevaluated it. We haven't thought about it critically at all. We just keep saying it, even though it means absolutely nothing. We don't acknowledge any advancement in thinking or whether or not something makes sense to say anymore. We just keep trucking right along with the term Metroidvania, completely indifferent to it. And I really wish it would end. But since it's not going to end, I guess all I can do is wish. Alright, look. I know I'm not changing the world here. I know people are still going to say Metroidvania and misuse Metroidvania. And indie developers are going to make whatever they think is a Metroidvania. This battle has already been decided. And I'm on the losing end. And that's fine. Okay? So, if you've been listening to this and marveling how one man could be this upset by a single term, which I don't blame you at all because I'm insane, let me leave you with this, and this will be my final statement on the matter, okay? In any discussion about art, whether it's about video games or otherwise, nuance is king. That's the entire reason why I do this podcast, is so I can have knowledgeable, nuanced discussions between me and my co-hosts, amid all the dick jokes, of course. Without nuance and that establishment of objective fact that we can all agree on, we have nothing. Metroidvania is the antithesis of nuance. Metroidvania is a brain thief. It robs us of critical thought in favor of something much worse. I don't even know what. We can talk about video games in a much better manner than that term affords us. We can do better than Metroidvania, and we deserve better than Metroidvania. And I hope someday that can happen. But until then, I guess I'm done. This is your boy Dre. This has been your boy Dre. I hope this was not too boring to listen to. I really hoped you enjoyed this. I don't know if I ever have another solo topic in me. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. But until then, look in the description of this podcast to catch us on social media. And I'll see you next time. Bye.
You've been listening to